Hey guys, tonight we are going to think about roads that were not really roads yet, back in the long stretch of time before engineers, surveyors, or people arguing about paving contracts. For most of human history, there were only paths, and most of those were not designed so much as accidentally worn into the ground by whatever happened to walk there most often. Before there were milestones, there were trees with distinctive shapes. Before there were signposts, there were hills, rivers, and stories that told you which direction not to choose if you wanted to get home again. The world did not feel empty without roads. It simply felt slower, softer, and slightly uncertain at the edges. People walked anyway. They stepped into tracks left by animals, followed them because that was easier than pushing through brush, and discovered that a trail was just a habit the landscape had agreed to remember. In most places, the first paths were made by animals that were not especially interested in helping humans get anywhere. Herds moved between water and grazing. Predators circled their territories. Smaller animals traced nervous little corridors from cover to cover. Over years, hooves and paws pressed the same thin lines through the grass and underbrush. When people arrived, they noticed that walking in those lines was less exhausting than fighting the vegetation. A deer path became a human path with no discussion and no ceremony, just a quiet shift in who was using it more. Some of these routes were seasonal, stretching between summer pastures and winter shelters, or between lowland villages and higher, cooler ground. Rivers had favorite fords, places where the water was shallow enough and the stones mostly stayed put. People learned these points by repetition, by watching others, and by listening to stories that were essentially spoken maps, memorized aloud instead of drawn on anything. A parent did not hand a child a plan of the countryside. They pointed with their hand or with a stick. You go past the crooked tree. You keep the hill with the flat top on your left. You walk until you can hear the river louder than the wind. Then you look for the stones that shine when they are wet. These directions were not meant to be precise. They were meant to be familiar. The safest routes were the ones everyone could describe out loud from memory. In many early communities, people's mental maps were strings of remembered sensations. The wet patch where your feet always sank a little, the place where birds shouted in the evening, the bend where you once saw a wolf and decided never to cut across that meadow again. Movement was slow, practical, and close to the ground, with the landscape teaching its own quiet lessons step by step. When people began to settle more permanently, the paths did not disappear. They became more predictable. A village might be nothing more than a cluster of houses, storage pits, and small fields, but the ground between these places quickly developed its own tiny network. Every morning, someone walked from a doorway to a well, from the well to a field, from the field to a patch of grazing. Children ran the same loops while carrying firewood or following animals that were barely domesticated. These repeated movements pressed clear tracks into the earth, narrow and winding, shaped by small decisions. Walking around a puddle one day, detouring around a fallen branch the next. No one designed these routes on purpose. They simply persisted. When it was dry, they were dust. When it rained, they were mud. After enough feet and hooves had passed through the mud, they became ruts that remembered every cartwheel and every misstep. Weather gave these tracks their mood. In the dry season, villagers walked in rising dust, the ground powdery and light, footprints overlapping until they lost their edges. In the wet season, the same paths turned heavy and reluctant, clinging to sandals and animal hooves, swallowing dropped tools and lost beads. Wheels, when they existed, did not glide. They lurched, digging grooves that filled with foul water. Nobody expected the way under their feet to stay the same. A path might be swallowed by a swollen stream, or blocked by a fallen tree, or simply drift a few steps sideways over the years as people tried to avoid the worst patches. Movement was an ongoing negotiation with the ground, carried out silently, step by step. The idea that a road might defy the weather or insist on keeping its shape belonged to a future that had not arrived yet. In the first towns of Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, people began to do something slightly more deliberate. They tamped down earth in the spaces between houses, packing it with the flat side of tools or simple wooden rollers. The result was not smooth, but it was less chaotic. Along the lowest edges, they scraped shallow ditches so rainwater would have somewhere else to go besides people's ankles. In some streets, they laid planks or flat stones near doorways, a modest attempt to keep at least one step out of the mud. Markets formed along these rough corridors. On market days, the same strip of beaten ground had to carry everything at once: people, cattle, donkeys, low carts with solid wheels that complained loudly against every stone, and vendors arranging baskets of grain or fish. The air was full of bargaining and animals, and the surface underfoot remained stubbornly uneven, reminding everyone that the town was still mostly dirt pretending to be a street. Every so often, however, a path was given special treatment. In some Mesopotamian cities, the processional way that led to a major temple was actually paved. Baked bricks or carefully chosen stones were laid in close rows, edged by walls or decorated gates. During festivals, statues of gods were carried along this surface, accompanied by priests, officials, and crowds who were encouraged to be impressed. For a short distance, feet met something firm, deliberate, even slightly dignified. Then, at the end of the ceremony, people stepped off the careful pavement and back into the usual mixture of dust, refuse, and standing water. The impressive road was not built for everyday errands. It was built so rulers could demonstrate order on command. The labor that made it possible came from ordinary hands: farmers summoned for work duty, craftspeople instructed to shape bricks instead of pots, young men told to haul loads of stone they would never own. Beyond the towns, longer routes slowly assembled themselves out of many short trips. A herder walking to a nearby settlement with surplus wool, a potter taking a bundle of bowls to a village along the river, a fisherman trading dried fish for grain a few days inland. Each of them followed whatever path was easiest that day. Over time, their preferences overlapped. Ruts deepened in certain places. Clearings widened at regular intervals where people liked to rest. There was no grand opening of a trade route, just a gradual thickening of footprints along the same general lines. Goods did not travel in heroic, single journeys from one end of the world to the other. They moved in small relays, passing from one trader to another, each responsible for a modest stretch. At night, travelers slept in simple huts, village courtyards, or just outside someone's door, sharing fire, food, and the same hard ground. As kingdoms emerged in the Near East, some rulers began to notice that slightly better paths made it easier to collect taxes and send orders. What later historians call early royal roads were, at first, simply stretches of track that received more attention than others. Fallen trees were cleared more quickly. Muddy spots were filled with packed earth or stone. Bridges were thrown across inconvenient streams, though they were narrow and not entirely reassuring. The work was done as a duty. Villagers were summoned to repair a section of road the same way they might be required to dig irrigation canals or build city walls. In return, they were allowed to keep using the road they had just improved, which was not much of a bargain, but was rarely presented as negotiable. Messengers and officials moved along these routes faster than ordinary travelers, helped by fresh animals, escort, and the simple privilege of having somewhere specific to be on official business. The Persian Empire, a little later, would make this idea more systematic with what we now call the Royal Road, a chain of way stations and patrols that allowed royal messages to move faster than any ordinary traveler could hope to match. Its routes were older tracks and local routes, stitched together and improved where it suited imperial needs. At regular distances, there were stations with fresh horses, fodder, and people whose job it was to take a sealed packet from a tired courier and hand it to a rested one. Local villagers provided food, shelter, and labor for these posts, sometimes paid, sometimes merely told that this was part of being within the empire. For them, the road was another obligation. For the king's messengers, it was a narrow, controlled corridor. Between official riders, the same path carried quieter figures, small traders trying to keep out of the way, pilgrims heading toward shrines, and the occasional person who simply did not want to be found. For most people, travel remained stubbornly local. A day's journey on foot might be 20 or 30 kilometers, less if you were carrying a child, a bundle of firewood, or a basket of grain that had to arrive intact. You left at first light, walked until the sun began to lean toward evening, and then looked for somewhere safe to stop. The limits of your feet set the size of your world. Many people rarely went farther than the next village, the nearest market town, or a shrine visited on the same day every year. Visiting relatives could mean a walk of several hours each way, with careful attention to the sky and the shadows. Being caught on a path after dark was not romantic. It was just inconvenient and slightly dangerous, with uneven ground hiding itself and unfamiliar noises sounding louder than usual. So arrangements were planned around daylight. marriages, trade, funerals, and small celebrations all took shape within the simple fact that people needed to get there and back before night closed the paths. All of this movement, over centuries, created an intricate, shifting web of tracks that were always there and never quite finished. A path could fade if a spring dried up or a settlement was abandoned. Another could appear because someone discovered a slightly better ford or a gentler slope, and enough people copied the new choice. There were no milestones to insist on an exact distance, no posted rules about right-of-way, and very few moments when anyone stood back and admired the network as a whole. It was just how you got from one place to another. The grand stories preserved in later texts usually follow kings, conquerors, or legendary messengers racing along these routes, but the paths themselves belonged more to the people who walked them slowly. Women carrying water, men leading reluctant animals, children trailing behind with sticks, elders taking careful steps with pauses built in. Their journeys were short, repetitive, and largely unrecorded. If you could step back and watch the landscape over a very long time, you would see paths brightening and dimming, thickening and thinning, as if the ground breathed in patterns of use. Before there were paved roads with clear edges and formal names, there was this quieter reality. Countless feet making choices, wearing suggestions into the soil, turning the simple act of walking into the first modest draft of a road. It was slow, repetitive, and mostly unnoticed, which is perhaps why it worked so well for such a quiet time for ordinary people everywhere. Eventually, in a few corners of the world, the quiet web of paths met something far more deliberate. Where tracks had once wandered around hills and detoured gently to avoid marshes, new lines arrived that seemed to ignore the landscape almost on principle. These were Roman roads, and they did not drift, they cut. To a farmer watching from a field, the first sign was often not the road itself, but the surveyors, small groups of men with poles, cords, and an attitude of straightness. They looked along their sighting instruments, adjusted the position of a marker by a hand's breadth, and quietly informed the landscape that it would now behave. The official explanation for this effort was simple enough. The empire needed to move its soldiers, its orders, and its tax revenues without wasting time on bends. Legions were expensive to maintain and inconveniently slow if left to their own devices on older tracks, where a bad patch of mud could delay an entire campaign. A straight, well-drained surface promised predictability, which administrators in distant offices valued almost as much as victory. But the legions and governors were only the visible tip of the reason. Underneath lay a more general desire to tie the empire together in a way that could be measured, inspected, and, when necessary, billed. Roads allowed officials to appear where taxes were due, where grain should be collected, where a town had failed to provide enough men for conscription. Every stone laid on the ground was, in a quiet way, another hand reaching out from the center. The people who actually placed those stones were almost never the ones giving orders. Local communities were told to contribute labor. Prisoners of war and enslaved people were brought to dig trenches, haul gravel, and wrestle heavy blocks into position. For them, the grand strategic purpose of the via was less pressing than the immediate experience of blisters, sore backs, and the steady, dull ache of moving earth that did not want to be moved. A Roman road began with a line on the ground, sometimes marked by shallow cuts, sometimes by small piles of stones, and always by the slightly disapproving gaze of the surveyor who had drawn it. Once the route was set, gangs of workers removed the topsoil, exposing a trench that looked more like a wound than a promise of smooth travel. Into this they layered materials, large stones at the base, smaller stones and gravel above, then sand or fine gravel at the surface, each level tamped down until it behaved. The finished road rose slightly in the middle, a modest crown to shed water into drainage ditches cut along the sides, where frogs and discarded rubbish collected with patient indifference. Quarries near the route worked at a relentless pace, their cliffs slowly eaten away by hammers and wedges, the air filled with dust that settled on nearby vines, olive trees, and washing hung out to dry. Villagers learned to live with the constant clatter of stone on stone, the grunts of haulers, and the intermittent shouting when someone misjudged the balance of a cart. In the imagination of later centuries, Roman roads are all broad, stone-paved avenues marching across the countryside like architectural manifestos. Some stretches did look like this, especially near large towns and in regions where traffic was heavy and imperial pride ran high. These major routes, the Viae Publicae, received the better materials, more regular inspections, and a higher chance that someone important might actually complain if a section deteriorated too badly. Beyond them, however, the network frayed into simpler gravel surfaces, compacted earth with some stones added for stability, and older tracks that had been grudgingly improved rather than fully remade. A farmer with a cart faced the usual choice familiar in many ages: stay on the official, well-built road that took a longer way round, or trust a shorter, bumpier track that everyone in the village swore was faster if you knew how to angle the wheels. Often the decision depended on the load, the weather, and how much time one had promised to be back before dark. The grand road with its neat edging stones might be kinder to the axles, but the side path offered fewer eyes, fewer officials, and, importantly, fewer tolls. As the network expanded, the empire developed a quiet enthusiasm for counting and labeling it. Along the roads, roughly cylindrical stones appeared at intervals, each carved with distances to the next town, and, more prominently, the name and titles of the emperor under whose authority this particular section had been built or repaired. From the administrative point of view, these milestones turned stretches of gravel and stone into legible units of imperial achievement. They recorded responsibility, allowing a distant official to say, with some satisfaction, that under Tiberius or Trajan, this many miles had been brought into proper order. For most travelers, the inscriptions were background decoration. A milestone was a convenient place to sit, to lean a pack against, to tie a donkey, or to use as a vague meeting point. Wait by the third stone after the bridge, the one with the crack near the top. Few people paused to read the careful Latin, and many could not have done so even if they wished. The stone, meant as an announcement of imperial presence, functioned mostly as an immovable piece of furniture along a very long corridor. The life of the road was most visible at its stopping places. At intervals, the state maintained mansiones, official inns where couriers and magistrates could sleep, eat, and change horses without needing to negotiate with local hosts. These establishments were staffed by low-status workers who cleaned, cooked, shoveled manure, and listened to the complaints of travelers who found the bedding too hard, the food too plain, or the wine not quite what they were used to in the capital. Between the mansiones, smaller posting stations, the mutaciones, offered fresh animals for those on official business, their yards echoing with the thud of hooves and the resigned snorting of overworked mules. Around these formal nodes clustered all the informal services that naturally attach themselves to traffic. Taverns appeared where travelers were thickest, offering wine of varying honesty, stews whose ingredients were better not examined too closely, and corners where deals could be made out of the rain. Snack sellers stood by the road with baskets of bread, olives, nuts, or dried fruit, calling out to passers-by with the same phrases day after day until they lost any particular meaning. Prostitutes worked from small rooms or improvised shelters near busy stretches, their presence unremarkable, part of the ordinary commerce that followed movement as reliably as dust. On any given morning, the road woke early. Drovers set out with cattle or sheep, trying to keep the animals moving without blocking faster traffic. Small traders adjusted the straps on their packs. Families loaded creaking carts with goods and children in roughly equal amounts. Soldiers on the march added their own steady rhythm, sandals striking stone, equipment clinking in time, centurions counting the miles in their heads or aloud to keep the pace from drift. They moved because they had been ordered to, carrying the empire's force along the very surfaces built ostensibly for their convenience, discovering in the process that stone underfoot could be just as tiring as mud, only in a different way. Behind them, or sometimes in front, came peasants heading to market, leading donkeys loaded with vegetables, grain, pottery, or whatever else might fetch a few coins that week. Their journeys were short in imperial terms, but long enough for feet wrapped in simple footwear, the straps rubbing the same spots raw mile after mile. Pilgrims walked as well, following routes to local shrines or famous temples, their progress marked more by prayers and muttered bargains with the divine than by any attention to the engineering under their soles. Some of the travelers had chosen their movement, others had not. Enslaved people were marched along the same roads, sometimes chained, sometimes merely watched, relocated from one part of the empire to another with little ceremony beyond the requirements of the market. For them, the milestones counted not achievements, but distances from home, each stone another quiet confirmation that the road could carry a person away just as efficiently as it brought officials in. Whatever their purpose, Most travelers shared the same sensory world: the metallic ring of hooves on hard surfaces, the crunch of gravel under sandals, the dry taste of dust that rose invisibly until it coated tongues and throats. In rain, the road turned slick rather than muddy, a different kind of hazard, with wheels skidding and animals planting their hooves carefully on treacherous stone. Bridges and certain checkpoints introduced another feature of road life: the demand to pay. Customs stations stood at provincial borders or significant river crossings, modest buildings or booths where toll collectors and guards waited through long stretches of nothing much happening. Their work involved asking the same questions again and again. What are you carrying? Where are you going? Have you paid this fee before? Recording payments and trying not to fall asleep between caravans. They were rarely loved, occasionally bribed, and often ignored by those who knew the side paths through the woods or the shallow fords that bypassed official supervision. Small traders learned where to leave the main road, how far to push a cart along a rutted track to avoid a toll, and when it was still wiser to pay rather than risk a fine or the confiscation of goods. Over time, the roads aged in ways their designers might have preferred not to think about. Stones loosened under constant pressure, some tilting upward to form sharp edges that caught wheels and feet. Others sank, creating shallow depressions that filled with water after rain. Drainage ditches clogged with silt, fallen branches, and the small, persistent attempts of plants to reclaim space. Officially, maintenance was a shared responsibility, with local communities obliged to repair the sections nearest to them, either through providing funds or, more often, through supplying labor. In practice, enthusiasm varied. A stretch of road near a prosperous town that relied on traffic might be kept in reasonable condition, its potholes filled, its edges trimmed of encroaching vegetation, while a more remote section could decline quietly for years, the stones heaving and breaking while official reports lagged behind reality. Travelers adjusted, learning which parts of a route were likely to soak the wheels, which bridges had missing planks, which hills were best taken on foot to spare the animals. The road, intended as a finished product, existed mostly as a perpetual project, some sections newly laid, some under repair, many simply tolerated in their worn state. Not all Roman roads looked or behaved the same, despite the impression given by neat diagrams in later books. Across mountains, road builders carved ledges into rock, built retaining walls to hold the embankment in place, and accepted that steep gradients were sometimes unavoidable, leaving travelers to cope as best they could with panting animals and slipping feet. In marshy regions, the emphasis fell less on the surface and more on staying above water at all, with causeways and layers of brushwood forming a floating foundation under the stone and gravel. Desert roads relied on lines of wells, shaded shelters, and embankments that helped mark the way when sand and dust blurred the edges of everything, the solid track more suggestion than guarantee. In many places, older pre-Roman tracks did not disappear when the new, proper road arrived. They simply shifted to the side, continuing as footpaths or minor cart routes used by those who saw no need to climb onto the engineered embankment. The empire's planners might have preferred a single, rational network, but the ground kept its own memories, and people followed them long after orders stopped coming. Long after emperors faded, the stones continued receiving footsteps. Long after emperors faded, the stones continued receiving footsteps. When the officials who had ordered them laid were gone, the roads did not stage a dramatic collapse. They simply stopped being anyone's main responsibility. What had once been an imperial system became a scattered collection of useful lines through the landscape, each stretch depending on the energy and resources of whoever lived beside it. There were no more surveyors checking gradients, no more regular teams of laborers sent out with tools and instructions. Instead, there were farmers with shovels, village headmen with opinions, and landowners deciding whether a passable road was worth the cost of keeping it that way. In busy regions, the answer was usually yes, at least for the parts that mattered most. Elsewhere, weeds were allowed to experiment with small, patient advances between the stones. Some stretches shrank almost imperceptibly. A ditch was not cleared one year, then another, and water began to linger where it should have drained away. Frost worked gently at loose joints. One stone tilted, another slid. Carts bumped and shifted to the side to avoid the worst patches. Wheel tracks in the softer verge deepened into alternative lanes, half grass, half mud. What had been a broad, confidently paved surface in the age of governors and tax collectors narrowed into a central strip of uneven stone flanked by two beaten tracks, all three competing awkwardly for hooves and feet. No one announced the change. There was no decree abolishing this or that road. There was only a slow adjustment of habits, people choosing where to put their weight, where to drive their animals, and where to let the road quietly return to being ground. Some people saw more direct possibilities in the stones themselves. A well-made Roman paving slab was not just a historical artifact, it was a ready-cut building material lying conveniently underfoot. Villagers prized them up with levers, rolling them into carts, dragging them to new foundations for houses, barns, boundary walls, and, increasingly, churches. A stretch of abandoned road could supply an entire settlement with dressed stone at the cost of a few days' labor and some sore backs. The road, once designed to carry traffic, became a long, narrow quarry that gradually walked itself into the neighboring buildings. Where enough slabs were removed, the remaining surface became a patchwork of bare earth and isolated islands of stone. Carts began to avoid these uneven remnants, traveling instead in parallel along the side, first on grass, then through dirt that compacted gradually into a new, less formal road. Those who still needed to move more than a few fields' distance learned to live with this landscape of partial decay. Merchants no longer trusted the state to protect them along long routes, so they traveled in small groups, gathering in market towns, waiting until enough companions, pack animals, and borrowed weapons assembled to make the journey feel marginally safer. A man leading a string of mules with cloth, salt, or grain might also carry a spear, more for reassurance than effectiveness. Peasants going to weekly or seasonal markets walked with what they could carry, keeping to paths that looked used recently, avoiding stretches of roadside woodland where hiding places multiplied. They timed their departures so that risky sections were reached in daylight, even if it meant leaving home in darkness. Messengers for kings, bishops, or ambitious warlords rode through the same world at a slightly faster pace, choosing routes that still held some memory of maintenance. They noticed, perhaps more sharply than most, where authority thinned. A shallow ford that once had a small garrison hut might now have only a burned foundation and a rumor of bandits living somewhere upstream. Wooden palisades around bridges sagged, their gatekeepers replaced by local men collecting informal tolls with the air of people who half expected to be challenged and never were. Occasional armed escorts were arranged, but they could not be everywhere, and in many regions, the main defense remained simple caution and the fact that most travelers were not carrying anything worth a determined attack. Bandits existed, especially in wooded hills and narrow valleys where the road squeezed between rock and river, but most days passed without incident. People walked, glancing up at the trees from time to time, adjusting their grip on their packs, and feeling relieved each time the path opened out into fields again. As political structures shifted and new kingdoms appeared and vanished, another network grew quietly along the aging roads. Churches and monasteries multiplied, planted near old junctions, river crossings, and hilltops that had once mattered to imperial administrators and now mattered to bishops. The roads that led to them acquired a new purpose as routes not for tax collectors but for pilgrims. A woman from a small village might set out to visit the relics of a local saint reputed to cure fevers. A former soldier might travel to a shrine in thanks for surviving a battle whose cause he barely understood. Their journeys were rarely comfortable. They walked in worn shoes, slept in barns or under hedges when necessary, and arrived at monastic guest houses hoping for bread, a bowl of stew, perhaps a little ale, and a dry corner in which to sleep on straw. Monasteries developed a reputation, not always entirely deserved, as islands of safety in a turbulent countryside. For travelers, they were at least predictable. The bell rang, the day unfolded according to a timetable that owed more to prayers than to politics, and a lay brother eventually showed you where to tie your animal and where to put your tired body. Hospitality rules varied, but the basics were similar. A place near the fire if you were lucky, a share of whatever food was available, sometimes advice about the best route to the next town or shrine. Monks and nuns themselves were not always cloistered entirely. Some walked or rode from house to house within their order, or to councils and synods, counting prayers in rhythm with their steps, their habits brushing against the same thistles and mud as any peasant's tunic. Far to the east and south, where imperial structures persisted or reformed, roads received more deliberate attention. In the surviving eastern half of the Roman Empire, which historians later called Byzantine as if to tidy it into a separate box, certain arterial routes were patched and rebuilt to move armies and grain between key cities. Engineers still calculated distances, officials still worried about supplies. A farmer along such a road might notice occasional work gangs repairing a bridge or relaying a section of pavement, the sound of hammers briefly disturbing the usual chorus of animals and weather. Further south and east, the new Islamic caliphates organized their own systems. They marked and maintained paths across deserts and steppes, building simple caravanserais, enclosed courtyards with wells and a few rooms, at intervals that matched how far people and animals could reasonably travel in a day without collapsing. At these roadside enclosures, life settled into a repetitive pattern that would have felt familiar to innkeepers anywhere. Keepers swept sand from doorways that would be filled again by evening winds, drew water for passing caravans, and counted coins without much expectation of becoming rich. Travelers arrived, coated in dust, their animals moving with the particular resignation of creatures who have walked the same route many times. There were few luxuries: shade, water, a measure of safety behind walls that discouraged casual thieves, and gossip exchanged in many languages about prices, politics, and the state of other roads. A boy growing up at such a place might learn to recognize different peoples by their tack and clothing long before he could read their scripts. For him, the road was not a romantic line across the desert. It was simply where work, noise, and occasional interest came from. Closer to the old heartlands of the former Western Empire, the road's world narrowed to more local horizons. Small hamlets grew where a bridge still stood, or where two surviving tracks crossed. An inn might appear, not grand, just a house with a larger hearth, some extra space in the loft, and a signboard of some sort to suggest that strangers could pay to sleep under its roof. The innkeeper brewed ale of uneven quality, served stews that tasted mostly of whatever was cheapest that week, and kept a mental list of regular travelers: the peddler with pots, the messenger from the count's court, the pair of brothers who drove pigs to market in autumn. A blacksmith set up nearby, the ring of his hammer a familiar addition to the soundscape. Children lingered by the roadside, under instructions not to wander too far, and watched the passing world roll slowly by. Between these slightly brighter nodes, much of the road's length surrendered to the weather. Where stone surfaces had been stripped or broken, rain turned them to long bands of mud in winter and spring. Wheels carved deep ruts that filled with water. Horses and oxen pulled with lowered heads, slipping and recovering, while drivers walked beside them, boots caked and spirits correspondingly damp. In many regions, it became easier to load goods on pack animals than to drag carts through this evolving mess. A man with 2 donkeys could pick his way along the firmer edges of a track, between hedges and ditches, where a cart would simply sink. Summer brought different inconvenient qualities: dust that rose choking in dry stretches, loose stones that turned ankles, and hard ruts baked into sudden ridges. Travel plans adjusted accordingly, not according to a calendar of festivals alone, but to when the road was least intolerable. If the surface belonged to the seasons, the rights over it belonged, increasingly, to whoever controlled the nearest strong building. Lords claimed ownership of bridges and fords, asserting that their ancestors or tenants had once built or repaired them, and therefore that a fee was reasonable. A traveler approaching a river crossing might find a chain stretched across, or a gate, and a man with a ledger of sorts, or at least a wooden tally stick. The sums were not always high, but they added up, and resentment traveled easily in the same direction as the carts. Some lords hired men to patrol nearby stretches, more to assert presence than to ensure safety. Most of the time, supervision consisted of people watching other people. Villagers noticed unfamiliar faces, tracked who carried valuable loads, and commented on every incident for weeks until it dissolved into local anecdote. As generations passed who had never known imperial couriers or armored legions, the origins of the older, straighter roads faded from precise memory. People still noticed that some routes ran in unnaturally direct lines over hills and through forests, ignoring features that later tracks sensibly skirted. Explanations adjusted to available stories. Some said giants had made them in a single night, striding across the countryside with baskets of stones. Others credited long-vanished kings or more recent saints whose biographies needed impressive deeds. Old milestones, no longer legible or relevant, were dragged into fields to mark boundaries between strips of land. A shepherd leaning against one on a long afternoon might know only that his grandfather had leaned there too. For many villagers, certain paths were simply there, like streams or ridges, older than stories, older than the church on the hill, always used, never fully explained. In this long stretch between late empire and whatever came next, there was no single tidy system of roads, only a patchwork. Local tracks linked hamlets to fields and woods. Regional routes tied towns to markets and ports. Ancient paved fragments still guided feet where they had not yet been quarried away. A traveler moving across several regions stitched a journey together, one segment at a time, asking directions from farmers, priests, innkeepers, and other travelers, trusting landmarks, habit, and the simple fact that most roads led somewhere eventually, if slowly enough. By the 11th century, the patchwork began to thicken. Towns that had once been loose collections of wooden buildings around a church or castle grew denser, ringed themselves with walls, and discovered that they needed more from the countryside than occasional carts of grain. Bakers required steady flour, fullers required wool, and a town's appetite for firewood seemed endless. Roads, such as they were, began to pulse more regularly with movement. Farmers pushing handcarts, boys driving pigs, women carrying baskets of eggs or cheese, all going toward the weekly market and then back again before dark if they could manage it. Some walked several miles each way, leaving before sunrise, returning after dusk, feet sore, but with a few coins or salt or an iron tool that made the journey feel necessary. Around these growing towns, the road system arranged itself with a kind of reluctant logic. A few main routes linked one market center to another, forming long, wavering lines that often traced the ghosts of Roman roads but did not bother with their paving. These routes carried pack trains of wool toward ports, barrels of wine toward thirsty cities, and occasional official messengers attempting to move faster than everyone else and succeeding only slightly. From these main ways, narrower tracks wandered off toward villages and mills or bent around estates where the lord's deer would not appreciate disturbance. Across fields and commons, people created shortcuts that no one officially recognized but everyone used, wearing bare lines into the grass that, over years, acquired the dignity of being called paths. On most days, the quality of a road announced itself through the soles of shoes long before it could be seen. In wet seasons, deep ruts gathered water and mud until carts sank to their axles and required shoving, cursing, and sometimes unloading. Travelers watched the wheels of the wagon ahead disappear and quietly reconsidered their life choices. Those on foot tried to balance along the raised center or along the grassy edges and failed repeatedly. In drier weather, the same ruts hardened into ridges that twisted ankles and jolted bones. Dust rose in pale clouds that settled into hair, clothing, and the creases of faces. Leather shoes wore through at the toes. Many people simply tied rags around their feet and accepted that they would be damp, then dry, then damp again for most of the walk. Regular commerce tried to coexist with this uncertainty. Small traders with handcarts learned to plan their movements between the worst of the mud and the deepest of the snow. A peddler carrying cheap knives, ribbons, and combs might work a circuit of villages over several weeks, gauging when a particular hollow in the road would finally become passable, or when a stream, swollen in spring, had shrunk enough to be crossed without swimming. Farmers heading to market often left long before dawn to take advantage of the night's frost, which made soft ground briefly firm. They reached town when the sun was still low, watched the streets turn slowly back to mud during the morning, and trudged home after their business, a little richer and a little colder, following the same marks in the road. Rivers remained the most troublesome interruptions in these routines. Where a wooden bridge existed, it was frequently narrow, slightly crooked, and inclined to complain loudly under any serious weight. Loose planks clattered beneath iron-rimmed wheels. Gaps showed the water sliding past below, not dangerously far away, but far enough to focus the mind. Local communities were usually responsible for repairs, which meant that essential work competed with sowing, harvest, and everything else. A bridge might receive just enough new timbers to remain standing, and nothing more. Where there was no bridge, a ferry served instead. Travelers gathered on the bank, forming small, temporary crowds that had nothing to do but wait. Listen to the ferryman's comments about the current and watch the boat make slow, repetitive journeys from one side to the other. Crossing in winter or during floods added a patient, subdued kind of fear. People measured the risk in silent looks at the water rather than in grand statements. A swollen river carried branches, foam, and the occasional unlucky animal, all hurrying downstream much faster than anyone wished to travel. A ford that was safe in summer might disappear entirely under brown, moving water. Carts hesitated at the edge. Someone waded in to test the depth, boots filling slowly, cloak dragging. Sometimes the decision was to wait a day, or several, until the level dropped. Occasionally, impatience won, and wheels slipped, animals panicked, and goods floated away piece by piece. Tales of such accidents moved along the road for weeks, retold in inns and markets as cautionary stories that most listeners believed would never apply to them. Among those most willing to accept discomfort, river crossings and bad roads included, were pilgrims. Across Europe, paths converged towards sacred destinations: Compostela in the west, Rome in the south, Canterbury in the north, and countless smaller shrines that promised healing or forgiveness on a more convenient scale. Pilgrim routes were not separate roads so much as existing ones temporarily crowded with people who had pinned bits of metal to their hats and carried staffs for both support and identification. They traveled in loose groups, forming and dissolving as pace and temperament dictated. Some sang, others prayed, many simply talked, discovering that the road itself became a kind of moving village, full of stories, complaints, and the sound of boots repeatedly meeting mud. Along the more frequented pilgrimage corridors, the landscape adjusted. Hospices, hospitals, and monasteries positioned themselves at respectable distances from one another, near river crossings or at the foot of the more exhausting hills. Their roofs offered something travelers valued more than miracles: shelter. A pilgrim might enter the courtyard stiff, wet, and hungry, and be received not with luxury, but with calm routine. There would be a place to wash, a shared meal of bread, vegetables, perhaps a little meat on better days, and a straw pallet in a crowded hall where snores formed a kind of communal background noise. In return, the pilgrims brought news, small donations, and the comforting assurance that the road, however muddy, continued to deliver people to the door. Not everyone could travel as freely as they might have wished. Many peasants were technically tied to a particular manor, and while short trips to market or neighboring villages passed without comment, longer journeys required permission. A serf hoping to visit a distant shrine or an ailing relative several days away might need a written note from the lord or his steward, stating in unsentimental terms that this person was allowed to be elsewhere for a limited time. Towns, meanwhile, guarded their own privileges. Charters and guild rules specified who could sell cloth inside the walls, who could trade in grain, who might practice a craft. At the gates of some cities, officials inspected wagons and bundles, attempting, with mixed success, to distinguish honest peasants from unauthorized competition. For the men who watched those gates, the life of the road presented itself as a slow, repeating spectacle. They stood or sat in small guardhouses, noting the same faces week after week, the same herds, the same carts loaded with more or less the same produce. Most days passed in uneventful routine. A few brief arguments about tolls, a protest over a confiscated knife, a wagon wheel breaking inconveniently just inside the entrance. Between such incidents, there was waiting. Guards leaned on spears, traded gossip, carved bits of wood, and watched the dust rise and settle as people went about the business of keeping the town supplied. The road outside seemed always to promise drama at a distance and then deliver only more vegetables. Keeping the approaches to such towns usable required attention that few were eager to give. In many regions, the responsibility fell under what was politely described as a communal duty and less politely experienced as forced labor. Peasants were summoned at intervals to repair roads, dig ditches, and patch bridges, bringing shovels, baskets, and whatever enthusiasm remained after their own fields were tended. Work parties filled the worst holes with stones and brush, scraped mud from drainage channels, and hammered loose planks back into place. This happened, when it happened, between sowing and harvest, or on days when the weather ruled out more immediately profitable tasks. The results were functional but uneven, a smoother stretch here, a patched corner there, and long lengths of track that remained exactly as they had been, because nobody had quite reached them. Occasionally, more organized efforts appeared. A wealthy monastery, concerned about access for its tenants and pilgrims, might endow the rebuilding of a particular bridge. A guild of merchants, tired of carts overturning on the same bend outside the walls, might pay to have the surface there properly drained and surfaced with larger stones. These improvements rarely extended far. Generosity had clear boundaries. The carefully repaired stretch gave way abruptly to the usual mixture of earth, scattered rock, and puddles. Travelers noticed the difference with their whole bodies as wheels rolled smoothly for a brief distance and then resumed their customary lurching. Still, each fragment of better road hinted that the surface beneath their feet could, in theory, be something other than mud, dust, and improvisation. Inns and taverns punctuated the more heavily used roads at intervals, based less on theory than on where someone had once decided to build. A typical roadside inn was a practical arrangement of yard, stable, kitchen, and a few overworked rooms that smelled of smoke, damp wool, and animals. Travelers arrived with varying expectations and mostly shared the same results: a place to sit by a fire, a bowl or slab of something filling, ale of uncertain strength, and a mattress or pallet already shaped to previous occupants. Beds were shared by strangers as a matter of course. Snores, coughs, and the shifting of tired bodies formed the night's background. The staff lived by this slow river of people, recognizing regulars, speculating about the unfamiliar, and listening to news that arrived on foot and left in the same way. Stories changed slightly with each retelling as they moved along the roads. A rumor of famine in a distant valley grew sharper or softer depending on who told it and how many hungry faces they had recently seen. Reports of wars traveled more slowly than the fighting itself, carried by merchants who had detoured around trouble, by soldiers limping home, and by peddlers who had simply listened at too many crossroads. For the people who rarely left their home region, these second-hand accounts served as their map of the wider world. The road did not merely connect places, it connected imaginations, filling them with vague but persistent images of other towns, other markets, other muddy stretches over which other people were apparently also walking. Where a bridge narrowed or a road squeezed through a rocky pass, someone eventually decided to charge for the privilege of crossing. Toll houses sat beside such points like patient barnacles, with a gate or chain and a person whose main task was to wait. Hours passed with nothing to do but whittle, mend, or stare at the road until a wagon appeared and the brief ritual of payment could be enacted. Travelers grumbled, counted coins, and later searched for narrow tracks through fields or woods that might bypass the next gate. Inside prosperous towns, merchants and councils paid for cobbled streets that were uneven but firm. Hooves sparked, wheels rattled, and after the gates shut at night, the echo of any late cart announced itself to the whole sleeping neighborhood. Beyond the walls, most journeys remained modest. Neighbors walking together to church or market, wandering craftsmen and minstrels, and beggars moving slowly from village to village, the road serving as a thin, irregular thread stitching these small lives loosely together. As kingdoms slowly hardened their borders and rulers grew fonder of neat paperwork, the road acquired a new kind of user, the official messenger who was not supposed to be late. Kings, princes, and their councils wanted news to move faster than gossip and accounts to arrive before debts were forgotten, so they began to mark certain routes as more important than others. Royal posts were declared, lines across the landscape where horses and riders belonged to the state rather than to any particular manor or village. The same road that had carried a peddler and his bundle now also carried a courier with a leather bag and a strict understanding that someone in a distant capital was counting the hours. Along these favored lines, relay stations appeared at regular or at least hopeful intervals. A yard, a stable, a low building with a room full of ledgers and sand to blot the ink now counted as important infrastructure. Postmasters kept track of incoming and outgoing bags with the seriousness of people who knew that mistakes might be noticed by someone powerful far away. Hostlers and grooms lived by the rhythm of hooves, ready to lift saddles, fetch water, and lead out a fresh horse at any hour. Villagers saw the riders arrive in a spray of mud, exchange horses without dismounting for long, and disappear again, leaving only hoofprints and a slightly impressed silence behind them. None of this altered the fact that most people moved at the speed of their own legs. While the royal courier vanished over the next hill, peasants and laborers continued to trudge along the same route with baskets, tools, or children in tow. They stepped carefully into the ruts left by wagon wheels, skirted puddles they already knew were deeper than they looked, and paused to rest where shade or a convenient stone presented itself. The royal road, in their experience, was not especially royal. It was simply the main way to the market, the mill, or the neighboring parish, occasionally brightened by the sight of an exhausted horse being urged to one more gallop. As commerce thickened and towns grew hungrier for grain, coal, timber, and manufactured goods, roads that had once carried pack animals and light carts began to feel the weight of larger wagons. Four-wheeled vehicles creaked under piled sacks, barrels, and bales that pushed the limits of both axle and patience. Drivers walked beside them with long whips that were more suggestion than punishment, coaxing teams of horses or oxen to lean into their harnesses. At bad patches, the ritual was familiar. Curses, encouragements, shoulders pressed against spokes, a coordinated heave, and the slow, complaining roll of wheels climbing out of a rut that had been deepened by every similar struggle before it. Governments, noticing that vital roads were disintegrating under this new weight but reluctant to pay for them, relied on a traditional solution. Someone else would do it. In much of Europe, parishes or local communities were legally obliged to maintain the stretches that passed through their boundaries. On appointed days, known by various names, but remembered mainly with resignation, farmers, tenants, and laborers were summoned with spades, picks, carts, and whatever animals they could spare. Work that might have gone into their own fields went into filling holes with whatever came to hand: sods of earth, stones pulled from hedges, broken bricks, brushwood, and good intentions that compacted unevenly at the first passing cart. These efforts were earnest but fragile. A few days of heavy rain could undo a week's statute labor, washing loose material downhill and rearranging it into new obstacles. In low places, water gathered patiently until the road became a chain of ponds separated by narrow ridges of survivable ground. Carters chose a line, took a breath, and urged their animals forward, hoping to avoid the sudden sideways slide that meant an axle deep in brown water. Returning home, the same people who had shoveled and hauled shrugged at the damage. The law demanded that the road be mended. It did not insist that it stay mended for long. For most travelers, the road was less an adventure than an obligation extended outward. Peasants and smallholders followed it to rented strips of land that lay inconveniently far from their cottages, or to seasonal work in other parishes where an extra pair of hands might be hired for harvest. They walked with tools over their shoulders, food in cloth bundles, and an eye on the sky. Craftsmen and peddlers traced familiar circuits from village to village carrying wares, news, and a mental list of doorways where they were usually welcome. The same tracks also brought recruiting sergeants, tax collectors, and press gangs. To some, the sight of strangers with official ribbons or uniforms meant not opportunity, but the possibility of being marched away along the same road by force. At larger towns and important junctions, inns grew broader courtyards and longer stables to accommodate the increasing traffic of coaches and heavy wagons. The clatter of iron-shod wheels on cobbles announced the arrival of a vehicle long before it turned into the yard, bringing with it a gust of cold air, damp cloaks, and differing expectations. Ostlers hurried out to take reins and unhitch teams. Farriers inspected strains in loose shoes, and cooks eyed the passengers with the experienced glance of someone trying to calculate how much stew could be diluted without provoking complaint. Chambermaids, potboys, and stable hands lived by the timetable of these irregular arrivals, sleeping where they could and waking at the sound of a horn on the road. Inside the coaches themselves, comfort was a relative concept. Wooden bodies on leather straps offered the illusion of suspension, which vanished promptly when the wheels met a hole. Passengers, who had paid for the privilege of sitting rather than walking, found themselves packed together more closely than they might have chosen. Merchants with account books, small landowners visiting courts or lawyers, soldiers on furlough, and servants traveling with or without their employers all shared the same jolts. Conversation drifted between local gossip, complaints about delays, and the cautious exchange of opinions on politics or religion, usually abandoned when someone remembered that one did not know who else's cousin might be sitting opposite. Because parish labor and goodwill could not keep pace with the combined efforts of weather and wheels, other arrangements slowly appeared. In some regions, particular stretches of road were handed to groups or individuals allowed to collect tolls in return for improving and maintaining the surface. These early turnpike arrangements rarely created miracles, but they did produce more gates. Small huts appeared at bridges and narrow points, with a bar or chain that could be swung across the way. Inside, a toll keeper or his family counted wagons, noted loads, and recited the charges, with the calm of people who knew that no one liked them and that this dislike had very little effect on the schedule. Villagers, who had watched the road drown in mud for years, discovered that improvement had a price, measured in coins rather than in compulsory labor. Opinions divided neatly. Some welcomed the firmer surface near the gates, and the sight of stones actually staying in place through a winter, praising the new order, while mentally calculating how often they needed to pass that way. Others muttered that the road had been perfectly acceptable when one simply waited for a dry spell. In taverns, the subject of tolls joined the familiar list of grievances discussed at length and altered very little by all the discussion. The road remained, more expensive in some parts, equally muddy in others, and never entirely satisfactory. In bad seasons, even the best intentions in tolls could not change the basic facts of soil and water. Winter rains turned hollowed stretches into what travelers described, with some accuracy, as bottomless. Wheels sank, animals floundered, and passengers climbed out to lighten the load, discovering that the verge was only slightly less treacherous than the middle. Travel plans adapted. Farmers delayed journeys until frost hardened the ground, then set out in the dim hours with creaking carts, trusting that the frozen ruts would hold until midday. The road became a seasonal creature, welcoming and dusty in summer, uncertain in autumn, a narrow ribbon of usable surface between drifts in snow, and, in spring, a landscape feature best admired from a distance. On paper, meanwhile, roads were beginning to acquire a tidier existence. Printers produced strip maps and itineraries showing the way from one important town to another as a sequence of lines, junctions, and small sketches of hills or rivers. These were read by merchants, officials, and the few ordinary travelers who could both afford and decipher them. For most people, navigation still meant asking at crossroads, listening carefully to directions that referenced trees, wells, and houses that might already have changed hands or vanished. Letters and diaries from the time started to include brief, resigned notes on road conditions. A certain stretch found very deep, another passable with difficulty, a third so bad that no further description is useful. Rulers who worried about armies, not diaries, older surveys of main routes that might carry troops and artillery. Surveyors appeared with chains, measuring wheels, notebooks, and an air of slow concentration. They paced out distances, noted gradients, and marked spots where bridges should be strengthened or where a new alignment might avoid an awkward bend. Local people watched these activities with interest and caution, understanding that whenever the state looked closely at something, it was usually planning to use it more, tax it more, or both. Questions about the exact distance between two towns might, they felt, politely conceal questions about how quickly soldiers could be marched from one to the other. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, more formal turnpike trusts began to take shape in some countries. Groups of landowners, merchants, and other interested parties obtained legal powers to manage specific stretches of road, collect tolls, and spend the proceeds on improvements. They hired surveyors to straighten awkward curves, laborers to dig drainage ditches, and gangs of men to spread layers of gravel and broken stone that, in theory, would bind into a firm surface under traffic. The results were mixed. Some sections genuinely became smoother and more reliable, at least compared to their neighbors. Others seemed to swallow investment without losing their fondness for puddles. Ordinary travelers mainly noticed that there were more gates to open and close, and slightly fewer excuses for being late. Between the market towns, toll gates, and coaching inns, most stretches of road remained quiet for long hours. A shepherd might move his flock slowly along the verge, staff in hand, while the sheep investigated every tuft of grass that looked marginally different from the last. A solitary peddler with a pack higher than his hat plodded steadily, counting the milestones without much faith in their accuracy. Now and then, a lone horseman passed at a cautious trot, cloak pulled tight, acknowledging other travelers with a brief nod that conveyed both politeness and a mutual desire not to know too much. When no one was in sight, the loudest sounds were wind in hedges, birds arguing in the ditches, and the steady, unhurried crunch of feet on gravel. For those who walked alone, the road offered a narrow, uncomplicated space in which to think, or simply to let thoughts thin out until they matched the horizon. Distances that later generations would measure in miles and minutes were felt instead as a sequence of familiar sights. A crooked willow, a farm with a barking dog, a chapel, a bend where the wind always seemed stronger. The surface underfoot might change from dust to mud to stone and back again, but the act of putting one foot in front of the other remained reliably the same, a slow heartbeat across the countryside, a small, moving room without walls. By the later 18th century, the idea that roads might be deliberately improved, rather than merely endured, had become respectable enough to generate paperwork. Turnpike trusts multiplied, each with its own stretch of highway to worry about, its own minute book, its own assortment of local gentlemen debating the price of gravel. Across much of Britain and in various forms elsewhere, toll houses appeared like small, cautious teeth along the main routes. A driver might travel only a few miles before another whitewashed cottage and wooden bar invited him to stop, fish out coins, and pretend not to sigh. Inside the toll house, a family lived within arm's reach of the passing world, separated from it by a window, a ledger, and the comforting solidity of a door that they could latch whenever arguments about rates grew too enthusiastic. In theory, the tolls paid for better surfaces, straighter alignments, and drier feet. In practice, they also produced an energetic side business in avoidance. Farmers who had tramped the same muddy lanes for generations did not always see why they should now pay to walk on a road that crossed their own fields. Carts veered off at convenient gaps in hedges to follow rutted tracks parallel to the new, smoother way. Footpaths multiplied like quiet protests, running behind cottages, across commons, and over the edges of plowed land. In many districts, these unofficial routes became so well used that they were almost as permanent as the turnpike itself, though seldom acknowledged on maps, and never, of course, repaired by anyone in particular. Meanwhile, the official road passed through the toll-keeper's day like a slow, irregular river. The keeper rose early, because someone always wanted to go somewhere at an inconvenient hour. In winter, he peered through frosted glass to see a single cart piled with hay, the driver muffled to the eyebrows, the horse producing small, resigned clouds in the cold air. In summer, the shutters stood open, and flies investigated the inkpot while he waited for hooves or wheels. His work consisted mostly of noticing when something approached, stepping outside, naming a rate, and writing down a description of the load that was usually more imaginative than precise. Between these moments of commerce, he swept, mended, dozed, and listened to the weather commenting steadily on the roof. Occasionally, a stagecoach arrived, and the quiet dissolved into shouts, hoofbeats, and the clatter of iron-rimmed wheels slowing reluctantly. Passengers leaned out to stare at the toll board, as if reading it carefully might produce a discount. The keeper lifted the bar with the gravity of a man conducting a small ceremony whose significance only the accounting books would ever fully appreciate. Coins changed hands, names and numbers were scribbled, and then the coach lurched forward, shedding dust and fragments of conversation as it went. For a few minutes after such a passage, the road felt almost modern. Multiple horses, hurried timetables, luggage piled on top in quantities that seemed to ignore weight limits. Then silence returned, and the keeper settled back on his wooden chair to continue measuring the day in intermittent interruptions. Beyond the toll houses, another figure began to haunt the roadside, the professional engineer. Men such as John Loudon McAdam and Thomas Telford walked fields and verges with a different gaze from that of the farmer or peddler. Where others saw hills, they saw gradients to be calculated. Where others saw a charming bend, they saw an unnecessary curve that would add seconds to travel times and lines to maintenance bills. Surveying teams trudged ahead of them, carrying chains, levels, and staffs, planting small wooden stakes across meadows or along hedgerows. The operation was both scientific and slightly theatrical. A man in a top hat peered through an instrument balanced on legs, while his assistants paced obediently back and forth at his gesture, like participants in a slow, repetitive dance whose music was supplied by crows and distant church bells. Farmers watched from gates, leaning on their own, less precise sticks. They tried to decide whether these measurements would eventually mean a slightly easier journey to market or simply more traffic rattling past their front doors. The language of the surveyors was full of numbers. So many feet of fall in so many yards, such and such a radius for a safer curve, a recommended maximum gradient that would not overexert the horses. Local people understood gradients in other units, how long it took to push a loaded barrow up the hill, how many times they needed to stop and breathe, how heavy their legs felt at the top. The engineer's notebook translated these sensations into ratios and decimals, useful for committees and plans, but curiously silent about the weight of a basket or the sigh of a man halfway up a slope. The new gospel of road improvement had its own simple commandments. For McAdam, the proper road did not require deep foundations or elaborate paving, only a well-drained bed and layers of small, angular stones compacted under the regular passing of wheels. Water must be persuaded to leave the surface quickly, not invited to sit in puddles and meditate on the weakness of human intentions. To supply these stones, long rows of laborers sat or stood by the roadside, hammer in hand, reducing larger pieces of rock to fragments of a specified size. It was work that required accuracy, patience, and a willingness to ignore the protests of one's back. A good breaker learned to judge a stone almost by sound. One tap, then another, then a crack that foretold a small improvement in someone else's journey. For the travelers who passed over these carefully arranged fragments, the change was noticeable, though rarely dramatic enough to inspire poetry. Wheels no longer sank so deeply into mud. Ruts became shallower, though by no means extinct. Coaches could travel at speeds that made the scenery blur slightly, rather than remain fixed for hours. Inside, passengers discovered new opportunities for discomfort. A smoother road meant that jolts were fewer but sharper, carrying loose items across the compartment in unexpectedly direct ways. Yet arrival times shortened, postal deliveries acquired an air of competence, and coachmen began to speak confidently of schedules, a concept previously regarded as theoretical. The countryside measured the new efficiency in its own quiet manner. The thunder of a mail coach at night seemed to come more often, like a recurring weather pattern of leather, brass, and deliberate haste. Along the improved stretches, life rearranged itself to suit the increased pace without ever becoming truly fast. Coach-ins spaced themselves at practical intervals, each promising fresh horses, hot meals, and a room that might or might not contain sheets recently acquainted with water. Yards filled with noise when a coach arrived, ostlers running, dogs barking, passengers unfolding themselves cautiously from the interior. The blacksmith's forge glowed nearby, ready to refit a loose shoe or straighten a bent tire. The wheelwright kept a wary eye on the new speeds, which subjected wooden spokes and iron rims to unfamiliar strains. For villagers, the road was now a dependable source of mild spectacle. They could predict the approximate hour when certain coaches would groan past, and some households adjusted mealtimes to ensure that there was always someone by the door to watch. Those who operated and regulated this network liked their distances precise. Milestones and posts appeared with new regularity, carved or painted with the number of miles to the nearest important town, sometimes in two directions at once, so that the traveler could know exactly how far he was from places he had no intention of visiting. Administrators, postal officials, and engineers treated these markers with solemn respect. Reports calculated costs per mile between one stone and the next. Timetables assumed that horses and men would perform predictably over each measured interval. Ordinary walkers regarded the stones rather differently. They sat on them when their boots grew insistent, leaned bundles against them, arranged meetings by them, and let children climb them. The numbers were there, but most people experienced distance less in arithmetic than in aching shoulders and the welcome sight of a roof. Despite the improving surfaces and carefully counted miles, travel for most remained a matter of slow effort and regular discomfort. Farmers with carts of produce welcomed the smoother stretches that spared their wheels and slightly accelerated their journey to market. But they were still exposed to rain, wind, and the particular dampness that creeps between layers of clothing on long days. Peddlers and servants walked as they always had, one foot after another, noticing perhaps that certain hills felt marginally kinder and certain boggy patches had disappeared, but still measuring progress by familiar hedges rather than by the opinions of engineers. New figures, however, joined them on the road. Commercial travelers with sample cases, middle-class families heading for coastal air, tourists seeking landscapes they had admired in engravings, all began to trundle or ride along routes that had once been reserved for necessity. Then, in the middle decades of the 19th century, another line began to appear across fields and along valleys, similar to a road, but elevated, fenced, and much less interested in gradients. The railway approached with its own surveyors and instruments, its own calculations about curves and inclines, but it carried a different promise, speed that made even the briskest mail coach seem contemplative. In some places, the new tracks ran parallel to established roads, as if politely demonstrating a more efficient alternative. Coaching inns that had thrived on regular traffic found their yards strangely quiet once the coaches were taken off and passengers redirected to stations. Some closed. Others reinvented themselves as hotels for those arriving by train, or as modest public houses for the people who now drove carts between station and village, carrying goods that had completed most of their journey in a blur. Road traffic did not vanish. It folded itself around the new system in smaller, denser shapes. Carriers who had once driven weary horses the full distance between towns now specialized in the short haul from farm to station yard. Their carts queued beside platforms while porters moved crates, sacks, and trunks between rail and road in a steady, practical choreography. Villages that lay a comfortable distance from a station found their lanes busier with these local journeys, each one too modest to interest a timetable compiler, but essential to the working of the larger network. The main roads, relieved of some long-distance burden, settled into a quieter routine of regional traffic. Coaches that survived often served those who distrusted trains, disliked smoke, or preferred to travel at a speed that allowed them to continue recognizing individual trees. Even without the heaviest traffic, the improved roads did not maintain themselves. Roadmen were assigned particular stretches, sometimes only a mile or two long, for which they were quietly responsible. With a barrow of gravel, a shovel, and a rake, they walked their section like slow shepherds of an inanimate flock. They filled holes, scraped mud from drains, trimmed the verges, and noted where last month's repairs had failed to take the hint. Their work was by nature temporary. Frost, hooves, cartwheels, and rain collaborated patiently to undo each patch, as if offended by the suggestion of permanence. Here and there, chalk marks or small piles of stone indicated intentions for future attention. Beyond the reach of these routines, many rural lanes changed very little. Narrow, sunken, bordered by hedges or dry stone walls, they carried farm carts, parish gossip, and Sunday shoes at much the same pace as in previous centuries. Toward century's end, new wheels arrived. Bicyclists discovered that a macadam surface could be a kind of liberation, provided no one had scattered stones across it. They glided, wobbled, and sometimes fell, sharing the way with horses and carts. Early motor cars and wagons followed, testing gradients and curves, announcing that the age of improvement was not finished, preparing to quicken. They quickened slowly. Early motorists, wrapped in coats and scarves, persuaded the old roads to accept new speeds with a mixture of confidence and apology. Engines coughed into life in farmyards and town yards, turned onto familiar lanes, and rattled along surfaces built for hooves and iron tires. The lines of the network did not change much at first. A road that had once taken a day to walk, half a day to ride, and several hours to drive with a horse now took an hour in a car that was still not entirely trusted. People stared at the vehicles as they passed, then stepped back into the same ditches, gateways, and doorways their grandparents had used, letting the future go by in a cloud of fumes and dust. The roads noticed something more important than onlookers. They noticed their surfaces failing. Macadam that had tolerated carts and bicycles lost patience with heavier axles and higher speeds. Ruts deepened, puddles spread, loose stones rose up and struck unprotected engines and passengers. Complaints followed. Petitions were written, commissions formed, engineers summoned. The answer, when it finally arrived, was a kind of bandage. Tar sprayed over stone, rolled until it settled, and left to harden under sun and rain. Later, asphalt and concrete appeared, poured or laid in black or pale sheets, with a confidence that suggested permanence, even as everyone involved understood that it was simply another layer. The new work took place on old routes. In many places, surveyors looked at maps, at hedges, at long, straight boundaries, and decided that there was no particular need to invent anything. They traced the lines laid down by Roman planners, medieval carters, or early modern turnpike trustees, and instructed crews to improve what already existed. Centuries of ruts, gravel, and patching were buried under tar and aggregate. Cottages that had once watched dust now watched a smoother, darker surface being rolled flat by steam or diesel-powered machinery that shook their window glass. For the workers, this was not history. It was a job. Men spread hot tar with squeegees, carried buckets, steered rollers, and breathed fumes where their ancestors had trudged in mud or swung picks in quarries. They paused to eat sandwiches on the verge, feet dangling over old drainage ditches whose origins no one felt an urge to investigate. The day ended. The newly paved stretch cooled to a dull finish. In the morning, traffic tried it cautiously, then with increasing confidence, then with impatience. Speed began to reorganize time. A journey that had once been notable enough to justify letters and overnight stays became something that could be fitted between breakfast and lunch. Buses appeared, painted in company colors, offering regular services along the most reliable roads. Commuters emerged, not necessarily as a new species, but in much greater numbers, using the improved surfaces to live in one place and work in another, twice a day, 5 or 6 days a week. For them, the road was no longer an event. It was a corridor they moved through on automatic pilot, thinking about anything else. Pedestrians adjusted to their altered status. They were no longer the default users of the road, but an inconvenience that official signs politely warned drivers about. Pavements, where they existed, carried those on foot a few feet to the side of lines that might have been walked down the middle for centuries. In villages without pavements, people pressed themselves into hedges when lorries passed, feeling the modern gust of displaced air while standing on very familiar ground. School children walked to and from lessons along verges cut into patterns by tires, playing games that ignored the deep age of the route beneath their shoes. The past did not vanish entirely. It retreated to the edges. Old milestones, displaced by modern metal signs, lingered in grass and brambles. Their inscriptions, once crisply cut, eroded into softened numerals and letters that only the patient or the bored could decipher. Former toll houses, bought and converted, sprouted curtains and flower pots, but the ghosts of their gates remained in oddly angled garden walls or in widened sections of verge where carts had once queued to pay. In towns, roadwork sometimes scraped away the tarmac to reveal older cobbles or stone pavements. For a day or two, the ancient surface glistened in the trench, then disappeared again under fresh material. Roadworks themselves became a kind of weather. They arrived without consulting anyone's plans, lingered longer than expected, and departed, leaving behind slightly altered conditions. Crews laid out cones in meandering rows that dictated behavior more effectively than many laws. Temporary traffic lights appeared on tripods, quietly blinking red, amber, and green to vehicles that had passed that point unimpeded for decades. Drivers learned new rhythms of stopping and starting, transforming what had once been a steady run between home and workplace into a sequence of episodes. This cue, that diversion, the other stretch of new surface that required a lower speed, for now. Beneath the interruption, the old continuity persisted. The road was rarely closed entirely. Lanes narrowed, routes shifted by a few meters, but the overall line remained. Engineers widened corners that had once forced carts to slow, trimmed banks that had supported hedges since the Middle Ages, and cut new channels for drains that emptied into streams whose courses predated any engineer. Each improvement was partial. Each carried within it the assurance that further adjustments would become necessary, probably sooner than planned. Life arranged itself along these altered, familiar lines. Inns that had served travelers on foot and horseback grew into hotels or shrank into pubs, depending on fortune, position, and initiative. Other buildings slid into the vacancies. Petrol stations appeared, modest at first, then brighter, then increasingly standardized. Under their canopies, attendants or self-service pumps delivered fuel to a steady stream of vehicles whose drivers stretched their legs by walking a few meters to pay and back again. In place of stables, garages or small workshops offered tires, oil, and repairs. In the windows of roadside cafes, condensation formed above fryers as staff watched cars and lorries go by, recognizing none of them but knowing their patterns. Houses that faced busy roads acquired double glazing, hedge screens, and selective deafness. Children growing up in such places learned to sleep through the nighttime progression of engines, the last bus, the late car, the early milk tanker, the newspaper van. Older residents, who remembered quieter years when horse hooves and iron rims had made deliberate individual sounds, compared those memories with the present hum and hiss, and concluded that nostalgia had not included the smell. Dust from the old days was replaced by exhaust, then by other, more subtle fumes. Laundry took on the atmosphere of traffic even when no one opened a window. Not every road grew busier. Some, sidestepped by new bypasses or ring roads, relaxed. The main line of through traffic migrated to a straighter, wider route, engineered to modern standards, leaving behind curves that no longer had to prove themselves against high-speed cornering. On these old sections, parked cars replaced rattling carts. Grass softened the edges of carriageways built for more ambitious flows. The old inn might survive by serving Sunday lunches to visitors who appreciated its lack of heavy vehicles outside. Or it might close, its yard slowly reverting to something between garden and memory. Elsewhere, disused railway track beds, victims of changing economics and policy, were repurposed for feet and pedals. The rail engineers had shared the ancient dislike of steep gradients, so their gentle inclines and broad curves lent themselves well to new long-distance footpaths and cycle routes. Walkers set out along lines that had once carried express trains, themselves often aligned roughly along older roads and valleys. Signboards explained the history to those who stopped to read them. Most people moved on without pausing, content to enjoy the odd sensation of covering ground at human speed while surrounded by the designs of previous transport revolutions. In the countryside, many lanes changed little in appearance, even as the vehicles using them changed radically. Narrow, hedge-lined routes continued to insist on politeness through necessity. Cars met tractors and reversed, sometimes for considerable distances, to find a passing place. Cyclists occupied the center of the carriageway with an air of temporary entitlement granted by physics. Walkers, dogs, and occasionally livestock participated in a choreography that would have been comprehensible to inhabitants of earlier centuries, aside from the colors and materials of the conveyances. The smells remained reassuringly familiar. Damp earth, cut hay, blossom, manure, wet leaves baking gently on summer tarmac. For those living in scattered farms and small villages, distance still mattered. A trip to the nearest town, whether by car, bus, or bicycle, required planning. Shopping lists lengthened to justify the journey. Appointments were considered in terms of time on the road as much as the event itself. School children calculated how many bends lay between home and classroom. Elderly residents restricted their world to the routes they knew best, often those they had walked in childhood when surfaces were rougher but horizons somehow felt closer. The hidden history of the roads attracted particular kinds of attention. Archaeologists, invited or not, watched with interest whenever major widening or new construction cut deeply into old lines. Excavations reached through modern asphalt and macadam, past layers of 19th-century stone, down to earlier compacted surfaces marked by cart ruts or, occasionally, by the unmistakable geometry of Roman paving. Pottery shards, horseshoes, and unremarkable bits of metal emerged in spoil heaps, each one a fragment of earlier movement. Some were bagged and labeled. Many were quietly discarded in the knowledge that no archive could store every trace of human passage. Local history groups mapped vanished paths and hollow ways, comparing old estate maps with present-day satellite images. They followed faded green lanes that now ended in field boundaries, or traced the line of former coaching roads subsumed into modern suburbs. They interviewed older residents who remembered when a track ran that way rather than this, or when the bus stopped in front of a particular tree that had since been felled. Their findings sometimes resulted in small plaques fixed to walls or posts, explaining to anyone with a moment to spare that on this spot a toll gate once stood, or a Roman road passed nearby. Drivers hurried past, eyes fixed on the current situation rather than the accumulated ones. Children, as usual, accepted their surroundings as given. They walked or were driven along roads whose alignments had quietly governed local life for centuries, without being told that their morning journey to school followed a line once used by pilgrims, drovers, or royal couriers. The markings they noticed were those that applied to them directly: a zebra crossing, a lollipop person, a speed bump outside the gates. Under the painted stripes and molded humps, remnants of earlier surfaces sat undisturbed, carrying the weight of new routines without being acknowledged as participants. Adult commuters, absorbed in thoughts of work, home, or nothing in particular, accumulated thousands of miles on familiar stretches. They developed intimate knowledge of small features: a patch that always seemed slightly uneven, a corner that held frost longer than the rest, a drain that gurgled audibly during heavy rain. Yet most could not have said when the road had been first laid out, or why it bent around one particular field instead of another. The line simply existed, a given fact in a world full of other, more urgent details. From the point of view of the routes themselves, if such a thing can be imagined, the 20th and 21st centuries were just another phase of adaptation. Materials changed, speeds changed, the composition of traffic altered from mainly organic to conspicuously manufactured, but the underlying task remained the same: to provide a reasonably continuous surface between places people wished to be. When a section became inadequate, it was dug up, widened, resurfaced, or occasionally abandoned and replaced. The road system as a whole behaved less like a completed object and more like a very large, slowly shifting construction site, always tidied up just enough for daily use. Motorways and expressways, built with the confident handwriting of modern engineering, cut across older patterns while still respecting certain constraints. They followed river valleys and contour lines already familiar to Roman surveyors and medieval drovers. Junctions, service areas, and slip roads introduced new kinds of roadside life: chain restaurants, brightly lit forecourts, landscaped embankments populated by small mammals and discarded packaging. Yet even here, the logic of the old network persisted. Exits delivered vehicles onto older roads that threaded through towns and villages, often along alignments unchanged for hundreds of years. At night, these major roads became ribbons of light. Headlamps and tail lights traced long, patient curves across the landscape, visible from the darkened windows of nearby houses and from the cabs of lorries whose drivers measured their lives in rests and restarts. The sound was not dramatic, just continuous, a distant rush, like wind through trees that never quite stopped. Older roads nearby grew comparatively quiet, hosting only local traffic and the occasional deliberate wanderer who preferred smaller scales. The long, quiet life of roads is not, in the end, contained in grand projects or celebrated routes. It resides in the ordinary, repeated journeys that rarely earn a place in any record. A worker cycling the same lane to the same factory for 30 years, a delivery van following a meticulously optimized route through suburban streets, a parent driving to the supermarket twice a week, a nurse catching an early bus along a damp arterial road before dawn. All trace and retrace lines that predate their specific reasons for travel. The road does not know why people use it. It simply receives their wheels and feet. Over time, surfaces crack, potholes form, markings fade. Someone reports the damage. A crew arrives, unrolls cones, applies fresh material, repaints lines, and departs. For a while, the repaired section looks almost new. Then winter passes through. Loaded lorries intensify their routines, sunlight and frost negotiate with bitumen, and the cycle resumes. The sense that any piece of road is permanently finished exists mostly in brochures and opening ceremonies. The reality is a continuous negotiation between decay and maintenance, carried out in fluorescent jackets and steel-toed boots. Along the way, toll booths have been replaced, relocated, automated, or abolished. Their economic logic has shifted, but the habit of paying for progression has proved durable. Milestones, when they survive, are largely ignored, their function absorbed by electronic navigation that recalculates in real time. Yet the essential experience of moving along a line remains recognizable across centuries. The sequence of landmarks, the quiet satisfaction of reaching a familiar bend, the mild irritation at delay, the small relief when a known destination comes into view. The roads continue. They narrow, widen, straighten, and curve in response to pressure and policy. But the lines tying together settlements, fields, factories, and coasts prove stubborn. Under successive skins of gravel, stone, tar, and asphalt, older layers persist, compressed testimonies to feet, hooves, wheels, and tracks. People go about their days, using these routes without ceremony, rarely thinking about the depth beneath their tires or shoes. The road is simply there, a companion to routine, slipping under each journey and out of mind as soon as the door closes. Tomorrow, someone will dig another trench, fill another hole, add another layer. Someone else will walk, ride, or drive over it without comment. The surface will bear them, as other surfaces have borne other travelers, along alignments chosen so long ago that their origins are mostly forgotten. In this way, the line endures, always slightly altered, never quite finished, stretching quietly forward into whatever journeys come next.